Following the destruction of Romulus, the capital of the Romulan Empire, by a supernova in 2387, the Romulan mining ship, the Narada, was sent back in time. In its time, the Narada was a large but fairly standard mining vessel that had been augmented by Borg technology. However, when it arrived 100 years in the past, in the year 2233, it was one of the most significantly advanced and militarily capable vessels in known space. In the year 2233, the Starfleet vessel, the Kelvin, was venturing around the borders of Klingon and Romulan space when it encountered an anomaly that could only be described as a lightning storm in space surrounding a forming black hole or wormhole. As the Kelvin was approaching the mysterious anomaly in space, the Narada emerged from the black hole, and this resulted in the Narada and the Kelvin facing each other down face to face. In the coming engagement, the objectives of the Federation starship, the Kelvin, would simply be to survive the engagement and hopefully achieve a peaceful resolution with the Narada. On the other hand, the confused crew of the Narada hoped to discern exactly when in time they were, and discover the location of Ambassador Spock, who had gone through the wormhole at about the same time. It's also worth noting that later in the engagement, the objectives of the crew of the Kelvin would be to cover the evacuation of as many shuttlecraft as possible under the onslaught of fire from the Narada. Upon emerging from the wormhole, the Narada almost immediately began powering up its weapons and preparing to fire on the Kelvin, which was very clearly outmatched, being far smaller and less advanced than this futuristic mining vessel. And while the Kelvin quickly responded by preparing its own weapons, the Narada shot first, firing a salvo of torpedoes at the Kelvin. This first salvo of torpedoes was remarkably effective. The first shots disabled the Kelvin's warp core and seriously damaged many of the ship's power systems, while the second shot completely stripped the Federation vessel of its shields. Well, the Kelvin did the best it could to hold off the oncoming onslaught of flechette torpedoes. Their phasers were simply overwhelmed by the sheer number of projectiles being deployed against their vessel, and were unable to eliminate all of them. However, it's around this time that the firing from the Narada stopped, and the crippled Kelvin was given a momentary breather, while Captain Nero, who was in command of the Narada, requested an audience with the captain of the Kelvin, Captain Rabaul. So while Captain Rabaul boarded a shuttlecraft and transferred over to the Narada, he placed his first officer, Officer George Kirk, father of James T. Kirk, into the position of captain while he ventured over to the mysterious futuristic Romulan vessel. However, after arriving on board the Narada and briefly being interrogated, Captain Rabaul was ultimately executed by Nero and his men, an action that was immediately recognized by the crew of the Kelvin who had been monitoring Captain Rabaul's vitals. Almost instantly, the Narada began opening fire once more on the Kelvin, which was now left defenseless in space. The Kelvin's weapon systems doing the best they could to hold off the onslaught of torpedoes that had once again resumed. The decision was quickly made by acting Captain George Kirk to activate General Order 13, which called for the evacuation of the Kelvin. The order was given for all crew members to proceed to the ship's shuttle bay on the aft end of its engineering secondary hull and prepare for an evacuation. While originally intending to put the ship on a collision course and abandon ship with the rest of the crew, George Kirk quickly realized that the ship's autopilot functions had been severely damaged and, in fact, totally disabled by the Narada's attacks, meaning that if the Kelvin was to be put on a collision course with the Narada, it would have to be done manually. Seeing no other option, George Kirk opted instead to remain on board the Kelvin while the rest of the crew, including his wife and unborn son, evacuated, using the Kelvin's weapons to hold off as many of the Narada's munitions as possible. Once the shuttle bay had been emptied of shuttlecraft and all of these vehicles had begun pulling away from the battle space, the Kelvin was placed on a collision course with the central region of the Narada, in between the ship's large prow-mounted spikes. As the Kelvin swung in towards the Narada, the weapons on the Kelvin still continued to fire, automatically tracking and targeting the incoming projectiles fired from the Narada at both the Kelvin and now the fleeing shuttlecraft, having managed to effectively shoot down a majority of the torpedoes that had been targeted at the shuttlecraft at the expense of allowing the weapon systems that had been targeted at the Kelvin to arrive at their targets. And 12 minutes after Captain Rabaul had departed the Kelvin for the Narada, the Kelvin itself slammed into the Romulan mining ship, doing a significant amount of damage on impact with the much larger Romulan vessel, leaving the Narada damaged and disabled but not destroyed, and allowing the remaining shuttlecraft to evacuate the combat zone. With the destruction of the Kelvin and the successful evacuation of its crew on the series of shuttlecraft, and with with the Narada being significantly damaged, this battle could be considered at best a stalemate or perhaps even a Federation victory, with the Narada being significantly damaged and much of the data collected by the Kelvin on this mysterious ship having managed to escape on board the shuttlecraft. The effects of this battle were so far-reaching that it created a branching timeline, with Starfleet being forced to take a more militaristic approach in designing future vessels to combat potential threats from ships like the Narada. If you'd like to learn more about the Kelvin, the Federation's representation in this engagement, I'll leave a link in the upper right-hand corner to my video on the history and design of that Federation vessel. And if you have any other battles you'd like to see covered in future episodes of Battle Analysis and added to the archive, you could let me know down below in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.